Hey everyone, tonight we're going somewhere that makes most historians uncomfortable. We're going to examine a possibility that doesn't fit neatly into our timeline of human civilization. What if the beings the Sumerians called the Anunnaki weren't the beginning of something, but the end? What if they were the last remnants, the final rulers of a world that came before, trying desperately to preserve what was being lost? Before we descend into this mystery together, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely enjoy these deep explorations into ancient enigmas. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your world right now. I love knowing that we're all scattered across the globe, separated by thousands of miles, yet connected by the same questions about what came before us. Now, settle in. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's investigation together. We're going to examine evidence that suggests the Anunnaki might have been the survivors, the inheritors, the last generation of something far older and far more sophisticated than we've been willing to consider. The story begins not with the rise of Sumer, but with its strange, sudden appearance, with knowledge that seems to have no origin, with a people who insisted, again and again in their own words, that they were restoring rather than creating, that what they built was a shadow of what had been, that the wisdom they possessed had been given to them by those who came before. And if we listen to what the Sumerians actually said, if we take them at their word, instead of assuming they were speaking in metaphor or inventing mythology to explain their own achievements, then everything we think we know about the ancient world begins to shift. The foundation cracks, and beneath it, something much older stares back at us. In the British Museum, behind protective glass, in a gallery that most visitors walk past without a second glance, sits a clay tablet no larger than a paperback book. Its surface is covered in wedge-shaped impressions, carefully pressed into the clay over 4,000 years ago by a scribe whose name we'll never know. The tablet is catalogued as part of the Sumerian king list, one of the most controversial documents ever discovered in Mesopotamia. Most people assume ancient king lists are straightforward historical records, chronicles of who ruled when, the kind of dry administrative documentation that civilizations create to track their own legitimacy. And for the most part, that's exactly what king lists are. The Egyptian pharaonic lists, the Chinese dynastic records, the Assyrian limu lists, they're all relatively comprehensible. Names, reign lengths, occasionally a notable achievement. The numbers might be exaggerated, the chronology might be disputed, but the basic structure makes sense. The Sumerian king list does not make sense. It begins conventionally enough with a formal declaration. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Then it names the first ruler, Alulim, who reigned for 28,800 years. Not 28 years, not 280 years, 28,800 years. His successor, Al-Algar, reigned for 36,000 years. The next king, Enmenluana, ruled for 43,200 years. 8 kings total are listed for the city of Eridu, each with reigns measured in tens of thousands of years. Then the list moves to the next city, Bad Tibira, where 5 more kings ruled for similarly impossible lengths. Then Larak, with 1 king reigning for 28,800 years. Then Sippar, then Shuruppak. All told, the king list names 8 antediluvian cities and dozens of rulers whose combined reigns span well over 200,000 years of continuous governance. And then, abruptly, everything changes. The flood swept over. After the flood swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven again, kingship was in Kish. That single line divides the document into 2 distinct sections, before the flood and after the flood. And the difference between these sections is stark. After the flood, reign lengths drop dramatically. Etana of Kish reigns for 1,500 years, still absurdly long by our standards, but nothing like the tens of thousands attributed to antediluvian rulers. As the list progresses forward in time, the numbers continue to decrease. Later kings reign for centuries, then decades, eventually reaching lengths that begin to align with what we know is historically possible. Scholars have debated the king list for over a century. The standard interpretation treats the antediluvian section as pure mythology, cosmic ages or divine eras symbolically represented through impossible numbers. The post-flood section, by contrast, is seen as increasingly historical, blending legend with genuine memory until we reach names that can be cross-referenced with archaeological evidence. But that interpretation leaves profound questions unanswered. Why would the Sumerians frame obvious mythology in the exact same administrative format they used for reliable history? Why use the bureaucratic language of reign lengths and succession if the entire antediluvian section is symbolic? Sumerian mythology, when it wants to be mythological, looks completely different. The Epic of Gilgamesh is clearly narrative poetry. The descent of Inanna is obviously religious allegory. The creation myths use symbolic language throughout. The king list uses none of that. It reads like a ledger: name, city, reign length next. No embellishment, no narrative, no poetry. Just data, presented in the same format used for historical kings whose existence we can verify. This suggests the Sumerians themselves saw no fundamental difference in kind between the antediluvian and post-flood sections. To them, both were records of actual rulership, actual governance, actual kingship that descended from heaven and continued through catastrophe into their own era. What makes this even more intriguing is the precision of those impossible numbers. They're not random. Every single antediluvian reign is a multiple of a specific Sumerian unit called a Sar, which equals 3,600 years. Alulim's 28,800 years equals 8 Sar. Alalgar's 36,000 years equals 10 Sar. Enmenluana's 43,200 years equals 12 Sar. This mathematical precision suggests encoding. When numbers consistently hit specific benchmarks, you're not reading biography, you're reading calculation. The reigns might not represent individual lifespans at all. They might represent cycles, epochs, astronomical periods measured in Sar units. The Sumerians were sophisticated astronomers who tracked celestial bodies with remarkable accuracy. They understood that planets and stars move in predictable cycles. Venus completes its synodic cycle every 584 days. Saturn takes roughly 30 years to orbit the Sun. Jupiter takes 12. Over long observation periods, these cycles create mathematical relationships, conjunctions, oppositions, patterns that repeat. A Sar of 3,600 years is close to certain long-term celestial periods when converted into Sumerian sexagesimal mathematics. Some scholars have proposed that the king list's impossible reigns encode astronomical observations spanning millennia, continuous star watching that would require either institutional memory passed down through countless generations or inherited knowledge from earlier observers. If the antediluvian section records epochs rather than individual lifespans, if 43,200 years means 12 complete cosmic cycles rather than one person's reign, then the king list becomes something else entirely. It becomes a calendar, a chronological system preserving the memory of how long something existed before catastrophe ended it. But here's what makes this interpretation genuinely unsettling: the flood. The king list treats the flood as a discrete historical event that actually happened, a moment when continuity shattered. And we know from multiple independent lines of geological and archaeological evidence that the flood did happen, not globally, not covering the entire planet, but within the boundaries of Mesopotamian experience, devastating enough to bury cities under meters of sterile clay. Leonard Woolley discovered this evidence in the 1920s when excavating beneath the city of Ur. His team dug down through occupation layers, finding pottery and tools and the normal debris of ancient urban life. Then, abruptly, the artifacts stopped. Clean clay appeared, 2.5 meters thick, completely sterile. No human activity whatsoever. Woolley assumed they'd hit bedrock and almost stopped digging, but something made him continue. Below that flood layer, the artifacts began again. An older city, an older culture, buried under 8 feet of water-deposited silt. The same pattern appears at Shurupak, at Kish, at Eridu. Civilization, flood layer, civilization. The geological evidence matches the textual evidence exactly. Something catastrophic happened around 2900 BCE that separated the Mesopotamian world into before and after. So if the king list preserves genuine chronological information encoded in astronomical cycles, and if the flood it describes actually occurred, then what was the antediluvian section documenting? What existed before the waters came? And more importantly, who were these rulers with their impossible reigns that might actually be measurements of time rather than claims about individual longevity? The Sumerians had a name for these antediluvian rulers, a term that appears throughout their texts. They called them the Anunnaki, the offspring of An, the princely seed, the great gods who walked the earth before the flood swept over and everything changed. We've been taught to read the Anunnaki as mythology, as gods invented by primitive people to explain natural phenomena they didn't understand. But what if the Sumerians were doing something else entirely? What if they were preserving institutional memory of actual governance, actual rulers, actual leaders from before the catastrophe? What if the Anunnaki weren't the founders of civilization, but its inheritors? Not the beginning, but the end, the last rulers of something much older, trying desperately to maintain order as their world collapsed around them. There's a pattern in how the Sumerians describe knowledge, and once you notice it, it appears everywhere. They never claim to have invented anything. Not writing, not mathematics, not astronomy, not agriculture, not law. Every significant development in Sumerian civilization is described in the same way. It was given. It was received, it was restored, it was brought down from heaven. Consider the development of writing itself, one of humanity's most revolutionary achievements. When Egyptian hieroglyphics first appear in the archaeological record, we can trace their evolution. Early examples are simple pictographs, crude drawings representing physical objects. Over centuries, these images become more abstract, more stylized, eventually developing phonetic components that allow the script to represent sounds instead of just things. We can watch this development happen. We have the intermediate stages, the awkward transitional forms, the experimentation. Cuneiform appears differently. When it shows up in the earliest Sumerian tablets around 3300 BCE, it's already sophisticated. 700 distinct symbols, combinations of logograms and phonetic elements, the ability to express abstract legal concepts, mathematical formulas, astronomical observations, and poetic metaphor. This is not a writing system in its infancy. This is a mature, fully developed tool being deployed by people who already know exactly how to use it. Where are the centuries of development that should precede this? Where are the proto-cuneiform experiments, the competing systems that were tried and abandoned, the gradual refinement from pictograph to symbol? They should exist. Every writing system leaves developmental debris, but Sumerian cuneiform appears standardized from the beginning, as if it was taught rather than invented. And that's exactly what the Sumerians themselves claim. In a hymn to the goddess Nisaba, patroness of writing and scribes, the text states explicitly, she received the measuring rod and the surveyor's gleaming line from An. She grasped the holy stylus in her hand. She received from Enlil the tablets of the heaven stars. The art of calculation was given to her. Given, received. Not invented, not discovered through trial and error. Given by those who came before, by the Anunnaki, who ruled in the antediluvian cities, who possessed knowledge that humans would spend centuries learning to maintain after the flood destroyed continuity. Mathematics shows the same pattern. The Sumerian base 60 system appears fully formed in the earliest tablets, already embedded in how they measure time, distance, and angles. 60 has unique mathematical properties. It's the smallest number evenly divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. This makes it extraordinarily practical for trade, construction, and astronomical calculation. Someone chose 60 deliberately, understanding its elegance. But who? The Sumerians don't claim credit. In a tablet from the scribal school at Nippur, a teacher instructs students, from distant days, the measuring rod and the gleaming line, the holy stylus, the tablets of wisdom, all were perfected and completed. We preserve what was established from distant days, not from our days, not from recent innovation, from distant days, meaning before living memory, before the current age, before the world the Sumerians inhabited. Their astronomical knowledge shows this most clearly. The earliest Sumerian star catalogues contain observations that require centuries of continuous sky watching to compile. Tracking Venus alone to understand its complete synodic cycle and its relationship to other planets takes decades of nightly observation. The Mul-Apin tablets, one of the most comprehensive Babylonian astronomical texts, but based on much older Sumerian sources, contain star lists, planetary motion predictions, and eclipse calculations that represent the accumulated work of generations. But here's what's strange. These observations aren't presented as recent discoveries. They're presented as ancient knowledge being preserved and transmitted. The scribes who copied these tablets in 1800 BCE were working from older exemplars, and those exemplars came from older sources, and those sources claimed to be preserving observations made, as they consistently phrase it, in distant days. The same pattern appears in Sumerian medicine. The earliest pharmacological texts don't read like experimental notes, they read like reference manuals. A tablet from Nippur contains dozens of prescriptions using plant, mineral, and animal compounds. Thyme for respiratory infections, willow bark for pain, fermented grain mixtures for digestive disorders. These remedies work. Modern pharmacology has confirmed that many Sumerian medicines contain biologically active compounds effective for their stated purposes. But developing this knowledge requires generations of careful observation. Which plants help? Which harm? In what combinations? At what doses? Medical knowledge doesn't appear overnight. It accumulates slowly, through trial and error, sometimes deadly error. Yet Sumerian medicine appears comprehensive from its earliest attestations, documented as though someone was already writing down established practice, rather than figuring things out for the first time. Their legal codes are equally sophisticated from the beginning. The earliest Sumerian law collections predate Hammurabi's famous code by centuries and already contain nuanced jurisprudence, laws distinguishing between premeditated and accidental harm, regulations governing property disputes, inheritance, contracts, and debt. Legal systems this complex typically evolve through case law, real disputes revealing gaps that subsequent legislation addresses. But Sumerian law appears comprehensive immediately, as if the framers anticipated the full spectrum of human conflict before encountering it. In every domain, knowledge, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, law, architecture, agriculture, the Sumerians present themselves not as innovators, but as custodians. They're preserving, restoring, maintaining something they inherited, and they're explicit about who they inherited it from: the Anunnaki, the great gods who ruled before the flood. The teachers who established the foundations of civilization before catastrophe disrupted everything. We've treated this as religious language, as primitive people attributing their own achievements to gods because they lacked sufficient self-confidence or understanding to credit human ingenuity. But what if it's documentation? What if the Sumerians were accurately reporting their own experience? We didn't invent this, we learned it. Someone taught us. Those teachers are gone now, destroyed in the catastrophe, but we remember them, we preserve what they gave us. We call them the Anunnaki. If that's what the Sumerians were actually saying, if we take their testimony at face value instead of assuming they must be speaking metaphorically, then the Anunnaki transform from mythology into something else entirely. They become the last generation of an earlier world. Rulers, teachers, knowledge keepers who presided over an already ancient civilization in the antediluvian cities, who tried to preserve that civilization when the waters came, and who succeeded just barely enough that fragments of their knowledge survived into the post-flood world, carried by refugees, transmitted through oral tradition, eventually written down by the Sumerians who inherited the remnants. The Anunnaki weren't the beginning, they were the end. The last rulers trying desperately to save what could be saved before everything they knew drowned beneath floodwater and time. The ziggurat at Ur rises from the Iraqi desert like a geometric mountain, its mud brick terraces still visible after 4,500 years. When Leonard Woolley excavated the structure in the 1920s, he was searching for the ziggurat's original foundation, expecting to find simple beginnings that gradually evolved into the massive platform he could see. What he found instead troubled him deeply. The ziggurat wasn't built on virgin soil. It was constructed on top of much older structures, platforms and temples whose foundations descended far below what should have been the city's earliest occupation. Woolley's team dug down through layer after layer, finding increasingly ancient construction. And the deeper they went, the more sophisticated the engineering became. This inverts every principle of archaeological stratigraphy. Normally, the deepest layers are the most primitive, simple structures built by people still learning their craft. As you move upward through time, construction becomes more complex, techniques improve, buildings become larger and more sophisticated. The archaeological sequence should show clear progression from basic to advanced. But at Ur, the sequence ran backward. The oldest foundations showed knowledge of load-bearing architecture, precise orientation to cardinal directions, and water management systems that required mathematical calculation. The later, upper levels showed degradation, simplification, as though builders were trying to maintain structures whose original engineering they no longer fully understood. Woolley wasn't alone in observing this. Excavations at Eridu, the city the Sumerians considered their oldest settlement, revealed the same pattern. The earliest temple, dating to around 5000 BCE in the Ubaid period, already demonstrated architectural sophistication. Central room with altar, niches for offerings, careful orientation. By the time Eridu entered the Sumerian period proper, the temples showed such advanced construction that they served as blueprints for ziggurats built 1,000 years later. But where did the knowledge come from? The Ubaid settlements surrounding early Eridu were simple farming villages. None showed monumental architecture. None showed organizational capacity for major civic projects. Then suddenly, Eridu appears with institutional architecture that wouldn't look out of place in a mature civilization. At Uruk, the pattern repeated. The city's defensive walls, built around 3500 BCE, stretched for nearly 10 kilometers and required millions of mud bricks. The mathematics alone is staggering. Building walls of that scale requires calculating volumes, managing supply chains, scheduling work crews, feeding thousands of laborers, maintaining the project across years. This level of organization typically appears after centuries of smaller civic projects. But Uruk's walls are there from the beginning, massive and competent, as if the city's founders already knew precisely how to manage projects of breathtaking scale. Inside those walls, the layout reflects careful planning. Residential districts separated from industrial zones, temple complexes positioned at cardinal points, streets aligned to facilitate drainage. The White Temple, built on a massive raised platform, shows sophisticated knowledge of load-bearing architecture. Its foundation required calculating weight distribution to prevent collapse, engineering knowledge that normally takes generations of building failures to acquire. Yet there are no collapsed proto-temples beneath it. No trial and error foundations, just competence from layer one. This pattern, mature systems appearing without developmental stages, extends across every domain of Sumerian civilization. Their irrigation networks appear functional from the start. No catastrophic failures are buried in the archaeological record. No abandoned channels betraying miscalculation. Just working water management that sustained tens of thousands of people. Compare this to early Egyptian irrigation, which required centuries of experimentation. Canals that silted up, basins that didn't fill properly, seasons where crops failed because the timing was wrong. The Egyptians learned through mistakes, adjusted, improved. Their agriculture became reliable through experience. Sumerian agriculture appears reliable from the beginning, as though someone already understood hydrology, gradient calculation, and seasonal timing before the first canal was dug. Archaeologists call this the Sumerian problem. It's not just that Sumer developed quickly, it's that it doesn't appear to develop at all. Between 3500 and 3000 BCE, other regions show villages becoming towns. Sumer shows cities appearing with libraries already stocked, with mathematical systems already standardized, with legal codes already comprehensive. Some scholars argue we simply haven't found the earlier stages yet. That erosion, flooding, or the shifting Euphrates River has hidden the gradual development beneath layers of silt. That what we excavate represents already mature colonies whose development happened elsewhere, in regions now underwater or buried beyond archaeological reach. But there's another possibility, one the Sumerians themselves point to, that they inherited sophistication rather than developed it. That the reason we can't find Proto-Sumerian civilization is because Sumerian civilization is the proto-version, the surviving remnant, the restoration of something that came before. Consider the phrase that appears repeatedly in Sumerian building inscriptions. This is the restoration of what was before, not this is our glorious achievement. Not we have built something unprecedented, but this is the restoration of what was before. Restoration implies something previously existed, was lost, and is now being reconstructed from memory or ruins. At Lagash, a boundary stone describes a treaty between rival city-states. But before detailing the new agreement, the inscription states, "The border that was established by the god Ningirsu in ancient times, this border is restored again." At Nippur, temple inventories list sacred objects passed down from before the time of memory. Clay cones buried in foundations describe renovations of structures whose first builders are forgotten. The Sumerians consistently present themselves not as pioneers, but as caretakers, rebuilding on top of ruins, maintaining knowledge that came from elsewhere, from some time earlier, from people whose names had already been lost. This humility would be unremarkable if Sumer emerged from a clear ancestral culture, but it doesn't. The Ubaid culture that preceded Sumer in the same region shows none of this sophistication. Their settlements were small farming villages with simple pottery and basic tools. Then, in what amounts to an archaeological blink, cities appear. Between Ubaid and Sumer, there's no gradual progression of increasingly complex villages. There's a discontinuity. A gap where, according to every developmental model of civilization, there should be centuries of awkward transition. What if that gap isn't empty? What if it's filled with something the flood destroyed? What if the antediluvian cities listed in the king list, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, weren't the first Sumerian settlements at all, but the last settlements of what came before, rebuilt after catastrophe, inhabited by survivors, eventually buried again under flood silt until post-Diluvian Sumerians built on top of them without realizing older cities lay beneath. This would explain the backward stratigraphy, the most ancient foundations showing the most sophisticated engineering because they were built by people who still possessed complete knowledge. The later structures showing degradation because they were built by survivors working from fragmentary memory, trying to replicate what they'd seen but no longer fully understanding the principles. It would explain why Sumerian knowledge appears inherited rather than invented, because it was inherited. Passed down from teachers who ruled the antediluvian cities, teachers the survivors called the Anunnaki, and eventually elevated into gods as the memory of them as actual people faded into legend. It would explain the king list's impossible chronology. Not individuals living for tens of thousands of years, but institutions persisting across thousands of years. Dynasties maintaining governance through many generations, their combined rule measured in Sar cycles. The antediluvian section, preserving genuine chronological information about how long something existed before the flood ended it. And it would explain the flood itself. Not divine punishment for human wickedness, but geological catastrophe. The final blow to a civilization already in decline, already struggling, already losing knowledge faster than it could transmit it. The waters came and finished what time had begun, drowning the last cities, killing the last teachers, forcing the last survivors to flee with whatever knowledge they could carry in their memories. The Anunnaki, in this reconstruction, weren't gods descending from space. They were people, rulers of a much older civilization that predated Sumer by thousands of years. A civilization sophisticated enough to develop advanced mathematics, astronomy, and engineering. Organized enough to maintain institutional knowledge across generations. Large enough to build cities in the antediluvian locations, the kingless names. And when catastrophe came, when their world drowned, a few survived. They carried fragments of the old knowledge to higher ground. They taught what they remembered to people still living in simple villages. Those villages became the Sumerians. And the Sumerians, grateful for the knowledge that elevated them from subsistence to civilization, remembered their teachers, called them the great gods, placed them in temples, made offerings to their memory. Over centuries, the teachers became legends. The legends became myths. The myths became religion. But underneath it all, beneath the theological elaboration, the original testimony remained. Someone taught us, someone who came before, someone who ruled cities that the flood destroyed. Someone we call the Anunnaki. If this is what actually happened, if the Anunnaki were the last rulers of a pre-flood civilization trying desperately to preserve knowledge as their world collapsed, then everything the Sumerians wrote takes on different meaning. Their myths aren't imagination, they're documentation, fragmented, mythologized, but fundamentally grounded in events that occurred. And the strangest part, the Sumerians keep trying to tell us this, in text after text. Inscription after inscription, we received knowledge from those who came before. We restore what was ancient. Kingship descended from heaven after the flood swept over. They're not speaking metaphorically, they're filing a report. And we've spent a century refusing to listen because accepting their testimony means rewriting the entire story of civilization's origins. The Sumerian language is an orphan. Linguists call it an isolate, a language with no known living or dead relatives anywhere on Earth. This shouldn't be possible. Languages don't spontaneously generate. They evolve from earlier tongues through slow mutation, carrying ancestry in their grammar, vocabulary, and phonetic structure. Every language we've studied comes from somewhere. Latin descended from Proto-Italic, which emerged from Proto-Indo-European. Chinese descended from Proto-Sino-Tibetan. Arabic, Hebrew, and Akkadian all share Semitic ancestry. Even when a language dies, it leaves linguistic DNA in the languages that replace it. Loanwords, grammatical quirks, phonetic fossils that betray origins. Sumerian connects to nothing. Its structure bears no resemblance to the Semitic languages that surrounded it in Mesopotamia. Semitic languages use root systems built from 3 consonant cores. Sumerian doesn't work like this at all. Instead, Sumerian is agglutinative, building complex meanings by stringing together smaller morphemes, prefixes, suffixes, and infixes attached to root words. This kind of system resembles languages like Turkish, Finnish, or Japanese more than anything spoken in ancient Mesopotamia. But Turkish, Finnish, and Japanese all have linguistic relatives. We can trace their histories, identify their language families, connect them to earlier forms. Sumerian connects to nothing. Linguists have spent over a century searching for relatives. They've compared Sumerian to Uralic languages, to Dravidian languages in India, to Caucasian languages in Georgia and Armenia. Every hypothesis hits dead ends. The vocabulary doesn't match. The grammar diverges. The phonetic patterns refuse to align. The only explanation linguists have settled on is that Sumerian represents the last survivor of a language family that went extinct. A linguistic lineage whose other branches disappeared without trace, leaving Sumerian isolated in time. But that raises an uncomfortable question. If Sumerians' relatives vanished, when did they vanish? And why is there no archaeological evidence of the people who spoke those related languages, unless those people lived before the flood? The timing aligns disturbingly well. Sumerian appears in writing around 3300 BCE. The flood layers at Ur, Shuruppak, and Kish date to roughly 2900 BCE. If Sumerian was already being spoken before the catastrophe, if it was the language of the cities buried beneath the flood silt, then its isolation makes sense. The disaster that deposited 2.5 meters of sterile clay also erased the linguistic context that would have made Sumerian comprehensible. We'd be looking at the last surviving dialect of a drowned language family. All its sister languages, all its parent tongues, all its related dialects gone, buried under silt and forgotten. What makes this more intriguing is how Sumerian grammar behaves. Linguists have noted peculiarities that suggest substrate influence, traces of an older language affecting Sumerian structure. Some grammatical features don't fit cleanly into agglutinative patterns. Certain word orders seem borrowed. Specific phonetic quirks appear inconsistent with the rest of the language. It's as if Sumerian itself is a hybrid, a language that absorbed elements from an earlier tongue, preserving fossilized structures whose origins are now lost. Languages do this when speakers of two different languages intermarry, or when a dominant culture imposes its speech on a conquered population. The resulting hybrid carries ghosts of both parents. If Sumerian shows substrate influence, what was the substrate? What earlier language left its fingerprints in Sumerian grammar? We'll never know, because whatever it was, it's gone, drowned with the antediluvian cities. But here's what we do know. Sumerian didn't die easily. Even after Akkadian, a Semitic language brought by new populations, became the dominant spoken language of Mesopotamia around 2500 BCE, Sumerian persisted. Scribes continued learning it in schools. Priests continued using it in temples. For over 1,000 years, Sumerian and Akkadian coexisted. Akkadian for daily life, Sumerian for scholarship and ritual. By 2000 BCE, Sumerian had stopped being anyone's native language. No children learned it at home, yet it remained essential. Babylonian kings commissioned Sumerian inscriptions to legitimize their rule. Scholars copied Sumerian texts to preserve ancient wisdom. Temples maintained Sumerian liturgies because the gods, they believed, preferred the old tongue. Sumerian became what Latin would become to medieval Europe, a sacred language, the key to older knowledge, the speech of ancestors who understood truths modernity had forgotten. Babylonian scribes created bilingual dictionaries, painstakingly translating Sumerian texts into Akkadian so the knowledge wouldn't be lost. They treated Sumerian with reverence, as though its words held power that transcended mere communication. Why such reverence for a dead language? Because Sumerian was the language of the Anunnaki, the tongue spoken in the antediluvian cities, the original language of knowledge, law, and divine truth. Preserving Sumerian meant preserving connection to what came before the flood, to the teachers, to the first rulers, to the world that had been lost. If Sumerian is indeed the last survivor of a pre-flood language family, then the language itself becomes evidence. Proof that something existed before Sumer, something sophisticated enough to develop complex grammar, something organized enough to require written communication, something that vanished so completely that only echoes survive in a tongue no one can trace to any other language on earth. The Sumerians themselves seemed aware of this. In the hymn to the goddess Nisaba, the text states, "In those days, long ago, humankind spoke with one tongue. The speech of Sumer, precious and princely, was shared throughout the whole land. Then Enki changed the speech in their mouths, brought contention into it, into the speech of humankind that until then had been one. This passage has puzzled scholars for decades. It describes linguistic unity followed by fragmentation, one language, then many. And it attributes the change to deliberate action by Enki, the god of wisdom, who serves as the Anunnaki's chief of knowledge. The passage echoes the Tower of Babel narrative in Genesis, where humanity speaking one language attempts to build a tower to heaven, and God scatters them by confusing their speech. But the Sumerian version is older by over 1,000 years and frames the event differently. Not punishment for hubris, but deliberate action by Enki, perhaps to preserve knowledge by encoding it in multiple linguistic forms, or perhaps in response to some catastrophe that scattered populations and isolated communities. Either way, the Sumerians preserved a memory of linguistic unity before diversity, of a time when one language sufficed, when everyone spoke Sumerian, or something ancestral to Sumerian, before the world changed and languages fragmented. If that memory is accurate, if there was indeed a period of linguistic unity in the antediluvian age, then the isolation of Sumerian makes perfect sense. It's not an orphan, it's the parent, the original tongue from which other languages diverged. And when the flood came, when the antediluvian world drowned, most of those daughter languages died with their speakers. Only Sumerian survived, carried by refugees to post-flood settlements, preserved by the Anunnaki teachers until writing could capture it permanently. The last written cuneiform tablet, dated to 75 CE during the Roman Empire, contains Sumerian phrases. By then, Sumerian had been dead as a living language for over 2,000 years, yet someone, somewhere in Mesopotamia, still thought it worth writing down, still believed that preserving the ancient tongue mattered, even when no one spoke it anymore, even when the world it described no longer existed. They were right to preserve it, because embedded in Sumerian grammar, vocabulary, and structure might be the last linguistic evidence we have that something came before Sumer. Something old enough that its language became the foundation for civilization's first written words. Something the Sumerians called the Age of the Anunnaki. The language is a fossil, and like all fossils, it testifies to something that once lived, thrived, and then vanished, leaving only traces for those patient enough to excavate them. In the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, a comprehensive database maintained by Oxford University containing virtually every recovered Sumerian text, there's a curious pattern in how creation is described. The myths don't present creation as instantaneous divine fiat. They present it as process. Trial and error, failed attempts followed by refinement. This is unusual. Most creation myths from other cultures describe perfection emerging fully formed from divine will. The Judeo-Christian Genesis has God creating humans complete and functional on the sixth day. Egyptian myths have Khnum forming humans on a potter's wheel, each one emerging perfectly. Greek tradition has Prometheus molding humans from earth and giving them fire, but there's no stage of failed prototypes. Sumerian creation myths are different. They include failure. They describe experiments that didn't work, beings created with defects, gods consulting, adjusting, trying again. The Enki and Ninmah text preserves this most explicitly. The goddess Ninmah, also called Ninhursag, collaborates with Enki to create humans after the younger gods revolt against their labor. But the first attempts produce defective beings. One cannot hold back urine, another cannot close its mouth properly, a third has poor eyesight, a fourth has paralyzed hands. The text continues through multiple flawed prototypes, each one given specialized roles based on their limitations before the process is refined enough to produce functional humans capable of reproduction and labor. This is not how mythology typically works. Myths don't document quality control problems. They don't describe gods making mistakes and correcting them. They present divine action as perfect, complete, unquestionable. Yet here's Sumerian tradition explicitly preserving a memory of trial and error, of gradual improvement through multiple iterations. Why would they frame it this way? One possibility is philosophical. The myth acknowledges human imperfection and disability, incorporating them into the creation narrative to give all people, regardless of physical or cognitive limitations, a place in divine purpose. But there's another possibility, that the structure itself is the memory, that the sequential experimentation isn't theological commentary, but documentary preservation of something witnessed or known, that the Sumerians inherited knowledge of a process involving refinement and selection, and they encoded it in the only framework available to them, the actions of gods. The ancient world had no concept of genetics, no vocabulary for heredity beyond bloodline, no framework for understanding biological inheritance. If someone from a pre-literate culture observed selective breeding, whether of animals or something else, how would they describe it? They'd need metaphor. They'd need narrative containers for processes they perceived but couldn't explain scientifically. The gods mixed clay with divine essence becomes the only way to say someone combined elements to create new forms. They made mistakes and corrected them becomes the only way to preserve. There was a process involving failure and refinement. The language is constrained by available concepts, but the memory survives anyway, encoded in mythological format. The Atrahasis epic provides even more procedural detail. When the younger gods revolt against their labor, the elder gods convene to find a solution. Enki proposes creating a substitute workforce, but the creation requires specific ingredients. Clay from the Apsu, the freshwater abyss, blood from a slain god named Welu, the womb of the birth goddess as the vessel where mixing occurs. The text is explicit about materials and process. Nintu pinches off clay. She mixes it with divine essence. She shapes forms. Then she divides the mixture, creating 7 males and 7 females, using multiple birth goddesses as vessels. 14 prototypes total, establishing reproductive populations rather than a single breeding pair. This sounds less like religious poetry and more like documentation. The level of procedural specificity, the attention to quantities and methods, the description of multiple iterations, all suggest someone was trying to preserve knowledge of how something was done, even if they no longer fully understood the underlying mechanisms. And then there's the most curious detail, the divine essence mixed into the clay. The text calls it temu, a word that translates roughly as intelligence, consciousness, or understanding. The blood of Welu contains something that transforms inert clay into thinking beings. The myth doesn't explain what temu is biologically, but it treats it as a transferable substance, something that can be extracted, mixed, shared, inherited. We read this as metaphor because the alternative is too strange, that the Sumerians were attempting to document a process they'd witnessed or inherited knowledge of, involving the deliberate modification of human cognition or capability, encoding it in mythological language because no other language existed yet to capture what they were trying to preserve. But consider the outcome. The created humans are specifically designed for labor. They're intelligent enough to understand instructions, dexterous enough to perform complex tasks, strong enough for physical work, but not independent enough to refuse or rebel, at least not immediately. The texts describe this as intentional design, purpose-built workers created to fulfill specific functions. This isn't how natural selection operates. Natural selection doesn't create organisms for particular purposes. It selects for reproductive success in specific environments. The survivors aren't designed. They're filtered from variation. Purpose, in the evolutionary sense, is always retrospective, never prospective. But the Sumerian texts describe prospective design, intentional creation, with predetermined purpose. The gods needed workers. They designed beings capable of work. The process required experimentation, but the goal was clear from the start. If we take the texts at face value, if we resist the urge to immediately convert them into metaphor or allegory, they're describing something that looks remarkably like what modern genetics would call directed modification, selection for specific traits, refinement through multiple generations or iterations, combination of elements from different sources to produce hybrid forms with desired characteristics. The Sumerians couldn't possibly have understood genetics in our modern sense. They had no microscopes, no concept of DNA, no framework for molecular biology. But they might have inherited memory of observations made by people who did understand selection, inheritance, and modification, who applied that understanding systematically over long periods, who produced results that witnesses could see but not explain. And when the flood came, when the antediluvian world drowned, that knowledge was lost. Only fragmentary memory survived, carried by refugees who'd seen the results without understanding the methods, who knew that humans had been shaped deliberately but couldn't articulate how, who preserved what they could in stories about gods mixing clay with divine essence, creating beings through careful process, refining across multiple attempts until the design succeeded. The Anunnaki, in this reconstruction, become the practitioners, the ones who possessed and applied knowledge about selection and inheritance. The last rulers of a civilization sophisticated enough to understand biology at levels we're only beginning to rediscover. And when their world ended, humanity forgot almost everything except the outcome. That we were shaped, that we were made, that someone long ago in the cities before the flood knew how to modify what nature had provided and create something new. The creation myths aren't imagination. They're the best documentation survivors could manage, encoded in mythological language, preserved across millennia, waiting for a future civilization to develop sufficient knowledge to recognize what the texts were actually describing. Maybe that's why the myths include failure, because failure is what happens when you're actually trying to do something real, when you're experimenting with processes you don't fully control, when you're learning through trial and error rather than commanding reality through divine will. The gods made mistakes because someone made mistakes. The process required refinement because processes require refinement. And the Sumerians remembered this because the survivors who taught them had actually witnessed it in the laboratories or breeding programs or whatever institutions existed in the antediluvian cities before the waters rose and drowned everything except memory. Among the thousands of tablets excavated from Sumerian sites, one category stands out for its precision and complexity. Astronomical texts, star catalogues, planetary observations, eclipse predictions, records spanning centuries of continuous sky watching, compiled into reference tables that remained useful for over 2,000 years. The Mole, Apian tablets named after their opening words, referencing the constellation Plough, contain one of the most comprehensive astronomical compendiums from the ancient world. The text lists stars and constellations. It tracks the heliacal rising of specific stars when they first become visible on the eastern horizon just before dawn. It documents planetary movements. It provides mathematical formulas for predicting lunar eclipses. This knowledge didn't emerge overnight. Understanding Venus's synodic cycle alone requires decades of observation. Venus appears as both morning and evening star, but its position relative to the Sun changes in an 8-year pattern that's difficult to perceive without systematic record-keeping. The Mol-Upin tablets document this cycle with precision. Tracking Jupiter takes even longer. Its orbital period is roughly 12 years. To understand its complete movement against the background stars, to predict where it will appear in any given season, requires continuous observation spanning multiple generations. The tablets contain this information. Saturn, with its 30-year orbit, presents even greater challenges. A single human lifetime might not suffice to track its full cycle. Only institutional knowledge, preserved across generations through written records and trained observers, makes Saturn's prediction possible. The tablets include Saturn's data, but here's what's remarkable. The Mul-Apin tablets, compiled around 1200 BCE, are copies of older Sumerian sources. The Babylonian scribes who created these versions explicitly state they're preserving ancient knowledge, not documenting recent discoveries. The observations they record reach back centuries before their time, possibly millennia. How far back? Some scholars have attempted to reverse calculate the star positions described in the tablets using astronomical software to determine when the observations must have been made, based on how stars have shifted position due to precession of the equinoxes. The results are startling. Many observations appear to date from 3500 BCE or earlier, during the pre-dynastic Sumerian period or even before. This implies continuous astronomical observation for over 2,000 years before the texts were compiled. Generations of sky watchers, night after night, tracking stars and planets, recording positions, identifying patterns, building databases of celestial motion that would eventually be synthesized into reference tables. But where was this observation conducted? Who maintained the program? The Sumerians attribute the knowledge to Enki and the Anunnaki. In the Babylonian text Enuma Anu Enlil, an enormous compendium of celestial omens, the opening line states, "When Anu, Enlil, and Ea established the observational standards for heaven and earth." The text credits gods with establishing astronomical observation as an institution. If we read this as documentation rather than mythology, it describes exactly what would be necessary to compile the knowledge the tablets preserve. An established program, standardized methods, institutional continuity across many generations, governance by authorities who understood the importance of long-term data collection. The antediluvian cities would have been perfect for this. If they existed for the thousands of years the king list claims in Sar cycles, if they maintained institutional stability across vast time periods, if they possessed governance sophisticated enough to prioritize knowledge accumulation, then they could have conducted the observation programs necessary to produce the astronomical data the Sumerians inherited. Consider what this would require. Dedicated observers, trained in recognition of stars and planets, standardized notation for recording positions, archives for storing observations, mathematical methods for analyzing patterns, institutional commitment to maintain the program across political changes, economic disruptions, and generational turnover. This isn't something a simple village culture could achieve. This requires urban civilization, social specialization, bureaucratic organization, and long-term stability. All characteristics that match descriptions of the antediluvian cities before the flood destroyed them. The Sumerians consistently frame their astronomical knowledge as inherited. In a hymn to Nisaba, patroness of scribes, the text states, "She carries the lapis lazuli, measuring rod and line. She took in her hand the golden stylus. She is the goddess who gives understanding of numbers. She causes the heavens to be measured. She surveys the earth." The measuring tools, the surveying techniques, the mathematical frameworks, all are presented as gifts from divine sources, from the Anunnaki who possessed them first. And the knowledge proves accurate. Modern astronomy confirms that the Sumerian star catalogues contain genuine observations. Their planetary periods match actual orbital mechanics. Their eclipse predictions work. This isn't lucky guessing. This is data collected systematically over centuries, analyzed correctly, preserved in formats that remained useful long after the original observers were gone. But the texts also contain anomalies, references to celestial phenomena that don't quite match current observations, star positions that seem slightly off when checked against modern calculations. Some scholars attribute this to copying errors, mistakes made by later scribes who didn't understand the technical content. But there's another possibility. Precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's rotational axis, which causes the position of stars to shift gradually over thousands of years. The North Star today, Polaris, wasn't the North Star 3,000 years ago. The vernal equinox, where the sun crosses the celestial equator in spring, moves slowly backward through the zodiac constellations, taking roughly 26,000 years to complete a full cycle. If Sumerian observations were made during or before the antediluvian period, if they recorded star positions as they appeared 3,000 to 5,000 years before the texts were compiled, then precession would cause exactly the kinds of discrepancies we find. Stars in slightly different positions, equinox points shifted from where they should be for the date of text compilation. The data would look wrong unless you understood it was ancient data, preserved unchanged despite precession. Some researchers have argued this explains certain anomalies in the Mulapin tablets and related texts. The observations are genuine, but they're old, really old, recorded when the sky looked different than it did when Babylonian scribes copied them, or when we observe it today. If that's correct, if these texts preserve observations made in the antediluvian period and maintained through the catastrophe, then they become time capsules. Windows into a lost world where astronomy was already a mature science, where institutions existed to conduct multi-generational research, where the Anunnaki rulers understood the importance of tracking celestial motion and dedicated resources to observation programs that would continue for thousands of years. The tablets themselves might be relatively young, compiled in the 2nd millennium BCE, but the data they contain might be far older, inherited from the antediluvian cities, preserved because someone understood that astronomical knowledge was too valuable to lose. When the flood came, when the cities drowned, most physical infrastructure was destroyed. Buildings collapsed, libraries washed away, material wealth dissolved in mud. But knowledge, if it existed in the minds of survivors who escaped to higher ground, could be preserved. Oral tradition could carry astronomical data until writing could capture it. Teachers could train students. The observations could survive even when the observatories didn't. This is exactly what the Sumerians claim happened. Knowledge was given. The heavens were measured by those who came before. We preserve what they taught us. We maintain the observations they began. We are the inheritors of their sky watching, their mathematics, their understanding of celestial order. If the Anunnaki were the last rulers of an antediluvian civilization, if they presided over institutions sophisticated enough to conduct millennia-long astronomical programs, then the Mulapin tablets and related texts are their legacy. The last surviving records of observation programs that began before memory continued through the reigns of the impossible-aged kings and ended only when the waters destroyed the infrastructure necessary to maintain them. But the data survived, carried by refugees, taught to post-flood cultures, eventually written down by the Sumerians who inherited it. And now, 4,000 years after compilation, we can still use those texts to understand ancient skies, to trace planetary motion, to predict eclipses. The observations work because they're real. And they're real because someone long ago in the antediluvian cities understood that knowledge of the heavens was worth preserving across any catastrophe, any flood, any disaster that might come. The Anunnaki watch the stars, not for mystical purposes, but for the same reason we do. Because understanding celestial motion means understanding time, seasons, cycles. It means being able to predict, to plan, to maintain civilization across generations. And when their civilization fell, when the cities drowned, the stars remained, and the knowledge of how to read them survived. Passed from the last rulers to the first survivors, from the Anunnaki to the Sumerians, from the world before the flood to the world after. The astronomical texts are testimonies, and if we listen to what they're actually saying, They're testifying to something that came before Sumer, something sophisticated enough to watch the stars for thousands of years and wise enough to know that knowledge was worth saving at any cost. In the winter of 2013, archaeologists working at a site called Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey announced findings that shouldn't exist according to conventional chronology. Massive stone pillars arranged in circular formations, intricate carvings depicting animals and abstract symbols, temple complexes requiring coordinated labor from hundreds of workers, all dated to 9600 BCE, over 11,000 years ago. This predates Sumer by 7,000 years. It predates Egyptian civilization by 8,000 years. It predates agriculture as we understand it. Göbekli Tepe was built by hunter-gatherers, people who supposedly lacked the social organization and technological capability for monumental architecture, except they clearly possessed both. The site covers 22 acres. Its oldest structures show sophisticated knowledge of megalithic construction. Pillars weighing 16 tons were quarried, transported, and erected with precision. The carvings demonstrate artistic sophistication and symbolic thinking. This wasn't the fumbling first attempt of primitive people. This was competent execution of complex vision. Göbekli Tepe forced archaeologists to reconsider assumptions about civilization's development. Complexity didn't necessarily follow a neat progression from simple to advanced. Capability could appear, persist for millennia, and then vanish, leaving gaps in the archaeological record where sophisticated cultures should exist but don't. And Göbekli Tepe isn't alone. Around the same period, between 9500 and 8500 BCE, other sites across the Near East show evidence of organized culture. Çatalhöyük in Anatolia was a settlement of up to 8,000 people, with standardized housing, sophisticated art, and long-distance trade networks. Jericho had defensive walls and towers by 8500 BCE, implying social organization and external threats. All of this predates Sumer. All of it demonstrates that humans were capable of civilization thousands of years before Sumerian cities appeared, which raises an uncomfortable question. Where did that early sophistication go? Why don't we see continuous development from Göbekli Tepe through to Sumer? The timeline shows discontinuity. Göbekli Tepe flourishes from 9600 to 8200 BCE, then is deliberately buried, the entire site covered with rubble. Çatalhöyük persists until 5700 BCE, then is abandoned. Jericho shows occupation gaps. The early settlements don't evolve into later civilizations. They end, and then there's a gap. Millennia where the archaeological record becomes sparse. Small villages persist, but the monumental architecture, the large populations, the complex organization, all fade. Not until Sumer appears, around 3500 BCE, do we see civilization re-emerge at the scale Göbekli Tepe had demonstrated 7,000 years earlier. What happened in that gap? Where did the capability go? Conventional archaeology attributes the decline to climate change, resource depletion, or social collapse. Göbekli Tepe's burial remains unexplained. Perhaps ritual, perhaps disaster. The answers are uncertain, but here's where it connects to the Sumerian testimony. If early, sophisticated cultures existed, thrived for millennia, and then declined or disappeared, if that cycle repeated multiple times across thousands of years, if rises and falls punctuated prehistory in ways we're only beginning to discover, then the Sumerian claim that they were restoring what came before makes perfect sense. They weren't the first civilization. They were the latest civilization, inheriting fragments from earlier peaks that had risen and fallen before them. The Anunnaki in this framework might represent the immediately previous peak, the civilization that came before Sumer, the culture whose ruins the Sumerians built on top of, the teachers who possessed knowledge because their own civilization had inherited it from earlier cultures, possibly stretching back to Göbekli Tepe or beyond. This creates a model of cyclical civilization rather than linear progress. Cultures rise, develop sophistication, persist for millennia, then decline. Sometimes catastrophe destroys them suddenly. Sometimes they fade gradually, but knowledge can survive collapse if refugees carry it, if teachers pass it to students, if institutional memory persists through oral tradition until writing can capture it. The antediluvian cities might have been the last flowering of a cultural tradition that began at Göbekli Tepe, persisted through multiple cycles, accumulated knowledge across thousands of years, and finally drowned under floodwaters around 2900 BCE. The Anunnaki would be the final rulers of that long tradition, presiding over its last phase, trying desperately to preserve what was being lost. When the flood came, when the cities drowned, most physical continuity was destroyed. But survivors carried knowledge to surrounding regions. They taught the villagers who would become the Sumerians. They transmitted mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, law, architecture, medicine. Not all of it, not completely, but enough that the Sumerians could rebuild civilization without needing to reinvent everything from scratch. This explains why Sumer appears suddenly with sophisticated systems already in place, because those systems weren't new. They were old, refined across thousands of years by cultures we no longer remember, except through archaeological fragments and the testimony of those who inherited the remnants. The Sumerians knew this. They said it explicitly. From distant days, knowledge was given. We restore what was before. They weren't claiming to be the origin. They were acknowledging inheritance, positioning themselves as continuators rather than creators. And if we take them seriously, if we stop assuming they must be speaking metaphorically and consider they might be documenting actual cultural memory, then the picture changes completely. Civilization didn't begin in Sumer. Civilization continued in Sumer. After catastrophe, after the flood, after the antediluvian world ended and the Anunnaki, the last rulers of that world, passed what knowledge they could to survivors who would carry it forward. Göbekli Tepe proves that sophisticated culture existed by 9600 BCE. The Sumerian king list claims continuous governance from antediluvian times. The flood layers prove catastrophe struck around 2900 BCE. The Sumerian texts claim they inherited knowledge from those who came before. Connect these data points. Early sophistication exists, gap follows, catastrophe occurs. Sumer appears with inherited knowledge. The pattern isn't linear development, it's cyclical. Rise, fall, preservation, rise again. And at the center of the final cycle before Sumer stand the Anunnaki, not gods from space. Not myths invented to explain mysteries, but rulers of the immediately previous phase, teachers who carried forward knowledge accumulated over thousands of years through multiple cultural peaks, leaders who watched their world drown and made certain that what they knew would survive in the memories of those they taught before the waters rose too high. The Anunnaki were the last, the end of a long tradition. The final rulers trying to save what could be saved before everything was lost. And they succeeded, partially. Enough knowledge survived that the Sumerians could rebuild, could create cities, could write, could calculate, could observe the stars. But the cost was enormous. Entire libraries drowned, institutions collapsed, most knowledge was lost. Only fragments survived, passed through the narrow bottleneck of catastrophe, preserved by refugees who became legendary, who were eventually elevated into gods because their knowledge seemed so far beyond what post-flood humans could achieve alone. The Anunnaki weren't the beginning, they were the ending. And the Sumerians were what came after, building on ruins, restoring from fragments, carrying forward what little remained from a world that had been far older, far more extensive, far more sophisticated than we ever imagined. At night, in museum archives where clay tablets rest in climate-controlled storage, you can still feel it, the weight of what was lost. Each tablet preserves a tiny fragment, a mathematical table, an astronomical observation, a legal precedent, a medical remedy, a hymn to a forgotten god, pieces of a vast knowledge system that once existed complete before catastrophe shattered it and scattered the fragments across time. The Sumerians gathered what they could. They wrote it down. They preserved it as best they understood how, encoding technical knowledge in mythological language because they no longer fully grasped the underlying principles. The gods did this. The gods taught us that. The Anunnaki established this, by which they meant someone before us knew this, and we're preserving their memory even though we can no longer explain how they achieved what they achieved. This is what survivors do. They save what they can. They honor those who came before. They carry forward fragments and hope that someday someone will understand what the fragments once belonged to. The Sumerians were survivors. The Anunnaki were what they survived from. The last rulers of a much older world, trying desperately to pass knowledge forward before the waters rose and everything ended. Did they succeed? Partially. Civilization survived. Knowledge survived. But most was lost. And we've spent 4,000 years trying to reassemble what the flood destroyed, working backward from Sumerian fragments towards something that came before, something the Sumerians called the time of the Anunnaki, when the antediluvian cities flourished, when knowledge flowed freely, when kingship descended from heaven and governance continued for spans measured in star cycles rather than human lifetimes. That world is gone, drowned, forgotten, but its testimony survived, pressed into clay by scribes who believed what they were writing mattered, who understood they were preserving memory, not inventing myths, who left us messages across 4,000 years, messages we've been reading as fantasy when we should have been reading them as history. The Anunnaki were real, not as gods, not as aliens, but as people, the last rulers of what came before. And everything the Sumerians built, everything they knew, everything they passed forward to us, through Babylon, through Greece, through Rome, through all the centuries that followed, rests on foundations they laid, trying to restore what the flood had taken. We stand on those foundations still, usually without knowing it. Every time we divide an hour into 60 minutes, every time we measure an angle in degrees, every time we reference a zodiac constellation, every time we follow a legal precedent, or take medicine based on plant compounds, or navigate by the stars, we're using knowledge that traces back through Sumer to something older, to the antediluvian world, to the Anunnaki, to the last rulers of a civilization that came before and tried desperately to make certain its knowledge wouldn't die when the waters came. They succeeded. The knowledge survived, not complete, not intact, but alive, transmitted across the centuries through clay tablets and oral tradition, through temple schools and astronomical observatories, through careful preservation by people who understood they were custodians of something precious, something ancient, something worth saving at any cost. The Anunnaki weren't the beginning of civilization. They were its guardians, its last rulers, its final transmission point before catastrophe forced humanity to start again. And when we read the Sumerian tablets, when we trace their mathematics and astronomy and medicine back to sources they themselves called ancient, we're touching that transmission, feeling the weight of what was preserved, recognizing that civilization didn't begin 5,000 years ago. It continued 5,000 years ago, after being interrupted, after being nearly destroyed. After the Anunnaki, the last rulers of what came before passed the torch forward to those who would become the Sumerians. This is what the tablets keep trying to tell us. This is what we've been misreading as myth. The Anunnaki were the end of something old. The Sumerians were the beginning of something recovered. And we, thousands of years later, are still using knowledge that survived that transition, still benefiting from what the last rulers managed to save before their world drowned and time moved forward without them. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, picture those scribes, 4,000 years ago, pressing wedges into wet clay, recording what they'd been taught, preserving what they'd inherited, making certain that even if they didn't fully understand it, even if the original context was lost, even if the teachers had become legends and the legends had become gods, the knowledge itself would survive. They succeeded. The clay remembers. The tablets preserve. The testimony remains. And if we're finally ready to listen, to take the Sumerians at their word instead of assuming they must be speaking metaphorically, then we might finally understand what they've been telling us all along. The Anunnaki were real. They were the last rulers of a much older civilization. They tried to preserve what they could before the flood destroyed everything. And the Sumerians, grateful inheritors of those fragments, built the foundation of everything we call civilization on knowledge. They didn't invent but received, didn't create but restored, didn't begin but continued. This is the restoration of what was before. The clay tablets whisper it still, in every wedge-shaped mark, in every careful calculation, in every preserved observation. From distant days, the knowledge came from distant days, and the Anunnaki, the teachers, the rulers, the last generation of that distant world, made certain it would reach us, across the flood, across the centuries, across the vast silence between their ending and our beginning. Good night. And may your dreams carry you back to those distant days, before the waters rose, when the antediluvian cities still stood and the Anunnaki still ruled, not knowing they were the last, not knowing their world was ending, but knowing, absolutely knowing, that what they had learned was worth preserving at any cost. They were right. We're still here, still reading, still learning, still building on foundations they laid. The last rulers of a much older civilization, reaching across time through clay and memory, teaching us still. The question that haunts every honest examination of Sumerian civilization is this: why did they stop? Why didn't they progress beyond what they'd already achieved? Why does Sumerian culture peak early and then plateau, maintaining sophistication without advancing it, preserving knowledge without expanding it, as if they'd reached a ceiling they couldn't break through? Other civilizations show clear trajectories of advancement. Egypt begins with simple pyramids and develops toward the architectural perfection of the new kingdom. Greece moves from archaic poetry toward classical philosophy and sophisticated mathematics. Rome evolves from republican governance to imperial administration. China develops from oracle bones to comprehensive bureaucratic systems. Each civilization builds on its own achievements, reaching higher with each generation. Sumer doesn't follow this pattern. Its earliest phase, the Uruk period around 3500 BCE, shows mathematical sophistication, astronomical knowledge, architectural competence, and administrative complexity that rival anything achieved in later periods. By 2500 BCE, Sumerian culture hasn't surpassed these early achievements. It's maintained them, certainly, refined them perhaps, but not transcended them. This plateau effect puzzles historians. Why would a culture capable of such sophisticated early achievements not continue advancing? The standard explanation invokes external factors: political instability, environmental degradation, competition from neighboring cultures like the Akkadians, who eventually absorbed Sumerian territories. These factors certainly contributed to Sumer's decline. But they don't explain why Sumer never advanced beyond its initial sophistication during the centuries when it was stable, prosperous, and dominant. Unless the ceiling wasn't created by Sumerian limitations, unless they'd inherited knowledge that represented a peak they couldn't surpass because they didn't fully understand the principles underlying what they'd received. They could maintain inherited systems. They could apply inherited formulas. They could preserve inherited observations. But they couldn't advance beyond them because the foundational knowledge, the deep understanding that would enable innovation, had been lost in the catastrophe that destroyed the antediluvian world. Think of it like finding an advanced computer in a society that hasn't invented electricity. You could learn to use the computer. You could maintain it, following procedures without understanding why they work. You could even copy it, reproducing its external form, but you couldn't improve it. You couldn't create the next generation of technology because you lack the foundational knowledge that made the original possible. The Sumerians might have been in exactly this position, inheriting sophisticated systems from the Anunnaki, systems developed over thousands of years during the antediluvian period, systems that worked that could be maintained, that produced reliable results. But systems whose underlying principles were no longer fully grasped because the catastrophe had killed the teachers who understood the foundations. This would explain why Sumerian mathematics appears complete from the beginning. They inherited a functioning system, preserved the methods, but couldn't necessarily derive new mathematical principles because they understood procedures without grasping deeper theory. They could calculate using base 60. They could solve complex problems using inherited formulas, but they couldn't necessarily explain why base 60 works so elegantly or derive entirely new mathematical frameworks. The same pattern appears in their astronomy. The observations are accurate, the predictions work, the mathematical models function correctly, but there's something procedural about how they're applied, as though scribes are following established methods without necessarily understanding the geometric and physical principles that make those methods valid. They can predict eclipses using inherited tables, but they don't seem to advance toward understanding why eclipses occur or developing new predictive models beyond what they'd received. Their medicine shows similar characteristics. The remedies work. The surgical procedures are sophisticated, but the texts read like reference manuals rather than research notes. They're preserving established practice, not exploring new treatments or advancing understanding of human physiology. They know willow bark treats pain, but they don't seem to be investigating why or seeking to isolate the active compounds. Architecture provides perhaps the clearest example. The early Sumerian buildings show sophisticated engineering, load-bearing calculations, drainage systems, orientation to cardinal directions, but later Sumerian architecture doesn't significantly advance. It maintains the standards established early. Occasionally buildings get larger or more elaborate, but the fundamental engineering principles remain consistent. There's no progression toward new structural innovations or architectural breakthroughs. This pattern, sophisticated systems appearing complete and then plateauing, makes perfect sense if the Sumerians were inheritors rather than originators. They received knowledge from the Anunnaki that represented the accumulated achievements of a much older civilization. Knowledge refined across thousands of years through multiple generations of development in the antediluvian cities. Knowledge that was sophisticated precisely because it wasn't new, because it had been tested, refined, and perfected over vast time periods. But when catastrophe destroyed the antediluvian world, when the teachers died, when the institutions that had developed and maintained that knowledge collapsed, the knowledge itself survived only partially. Methods were preserved, procedures were remembered, applications could be taught. But the deep theoretical understanding, the foundational principles that would enable someone to derive new knowledge independently, were largely lost. The survivors could teach what to do. They couldn't always explain why it worked. They could demonstrate procedures. They couldn't necessarily derive new procedures from first principles. They were inheritors, not innovators. Custodians, not creators. And the Sumerians, learning from these survivors, found themselves in the same position, maintaining sophistication without necessarily understanding it deeply enough to advance beyond it. This explains the reverent Sumerian texts show for ancient knowledge from distant days, the wisdom of the ancestors, the knowledge given by the Anunnaki. They're not just being poetically respectful of tradition, they're acknowledging that what they possess comes from a source they can't replicate, that the sophistication they've inherited exceeds their ability to recreate it from scratch. And it explains why Sumerian culture emphasized preservation over innovation, why scribes copied texts exactly even when they didn't fully understand the content, why architectural specifications were maintained faithfully across centuries, why mathematical methods were taught without modification, why astronomical observations were preserved precisely, because they understood, perhaps not consciously but intuitively, that they were custodians of something precious and irreplaceable. That loss of inherited knowledge meant permanent loss, not temporary setback. because they lack the foundational understanding to redevelop what was lost. The Anunnaki, in this framework, represent the last generation that possessed complete understanding. The final rulers of a civilization that had developed knowledge systematically over thousands of years. They understood not just procedures, but principles, not just methods, but foundations. They could innovate, derive, create, because they possessed the deep knowledge their culture had accumulated across vast time periods. But when catastrophe came, when the flood destroyed the antediluvian cities, most of that deep knowledge died with them. What survived was applied knowledge, practical methods, working procedures. The Anunnaki survivors could teach the Sumerians how to calculate, how to build, how to observe the stars, how to treat diseases. But they couldn't transmit the complete theoretical frameworks that had taken thousands of years to develop. They could preserve fragments. They couldn't restore the whole. And so Sumerian civilization, brilliant as it was, sophisticated as it appeared, was actually operating with incomplete knowledge, maintaining inherited systems whose foundations were partially lost. This created a ceiling, a limit beyond which they couldn't advance, because advancement requires understanding principles deeply enough to derive new applications, which requires foundational knowledge that was no longer fully available. The plateau wasn't failure. It was the inevitable result of inheritance without complete transmission. The Sumerians preserved what the Anunnaki managed to save. They maintained it brilliantly for over 2,000 years. They passed it forward to Babylon, to Assyria, to cultures that came after, but they couldn't significantly advance it because they were working from partial understanding of systems developed by a much older, much more sophisticated civilization that no longer existed except in fragments. This is why Sumerian texts consistently frame knowledge as received rather than developed. They're being accurate. They did receive it from teachers whose knowledge exceeded their own. Teachers they called the Anunnaki, teachers who were the last rulers of a civilization that had achieved far more than Sumer ever would, because it had existed far longer, developed far deeper understanding, accumulated knowledge across time periods that dwarfed Sumerian history. The Anunnaki weren't gods performing miracles. They were humans possessing deep knowledge. Knowledge that seemed miraculous to those who received only fragments of it. Knowledge accumulated over thousands of years by a civilization that rose, flourished, and fell long before Sumer appeared. And when that civilization drowned, when the antediluvian world ended, the knowledge partially survived because the last rulers, the Anunnaki, made certain that what could be saved would be saved, even if complete understanding could no longer be transmitted. Sumer inherited greatness. It didn't create it from nothing. And the ceiling it hit wasn't the limit of human potential. It was the limit of partial knowledge, received from teachers who'd possessed complete understanding but couldn't transmit all of it before their world ended, and catastrophe forced humanity to continue with whatever fragments had survived the flood. There's a specific moment when you realize the standard historical narrative has fundamental problems. It usually happens when you're looking at something that shouldn't exist according to conventional chronology. A tablet that's too sophisticated for its date, an observation that requires too much time to compile, a mathematical technique that appears without the developmental stages that should precede it. For many researchers, that moment comes when examining the Sumerian knowledge of what they called the precession of the equinoxes. This is the slow wobble of Earth's rotational axis, which causes the position of stars to shift gradually over thousands of years. The effect is subtle. Stars don't move noticeably within a human lifetime, but over centuries and millennia, the shift becomes measurable. The North Star changes. The vernal equinox moves backward through the zodiac constellations. Understanding precession requires astronomical observation spanning thousands of years. You need to track star positions across multiple generations, comparing observations separated by centuries, identifying the slow drift that betrays Earth's axial wobble. This isn't something a single observer or even a single civilization could discover quickly. It requires institutional knowledge, maintained across vast time periods. Modern astronomy credits Hipparchus, the Greek astronomer, with discovering precession around 150 BCE. He compared his own observations with those made by earlier Greek astronomers like Timocharis and Aristillus, noting discrepancies that could only be explained by precession. His calculations were remarkably accurate, determining the rate at about 1 degree per century, very close to the actual rate of approximately 1 degree per 72 years. But here's the problem. Some Sumerian and Babylonian texts contain references that suggest they knew about precession long before Hipparchus. The zodiac itself, with its division into 12 constellations through which the sun appears to move, might encode knowledge of precession. The concept of great ages, periods lasting roughly 2160 years, when the vernal equinox occupies a specific zodiac constellation, appears in Mesopotamian astrology. The full precession cycle takes approximately 25,920 years. To understand this cycle, to recognize that the stars shift position in a pattern that takes this long to complete, requires observation programs spanning thousands of years, not hundreds, not even 1,000 or 2,000, but multiple thousands of years of continuous, systematic sky watching with careful record keeping and mathematical analysis. Did the Sumerians possess this knowledge? The evidence is ambiguous. Some texts contain references that could be interpreted as awareness of precession. Others don't clearly demonstrate understanding beyond what could be learned from shorter observation periods. Scholars debate whether Mesopotamian astronomers truly grasped precession or whether later interpreters are reading too much into ambiguous references. But here's what isn't ambiguous. The astronomical data the Sumerians inherited required enormous time to compile. Even if they didn't fully understand precession, even if that specific insight waited for Hipparchus, they possessed observational databases spanning far longer than Sumerian civilization had existed. Star catalogs, planetary motion tables, eclipse predictions, all requiring centuries or millennia of continuous observation. Where did that data come from? The Sumerians themselves say it came from the antediluvian period, from the time before the flood, from observations made by the Anunnaki during rains measured in SAR cycles. If we take this claim seriously, if we consider that astronomical observation programs might have operated continuously during the antediluvian period for thousands of years before catastrophe interrupted them, then the Sumerians' inherited astronomical knowledge makes perfect sense. The Anunnaki didn't need to understand precession in modern terms. They didn't need to know about Earth's axial wobble or the physics of gyroscopic motion. They just needed to observe the sky systematically across vast time periods, to maintain institutional programs of star watching, to record positions carefully, to preserve observations across many generations, to accumulate data. Over thousands of years, such programs would naturally compile observations that revealed precession, even if the observers didn't conceptualize it as we do. They would notice stars shifting position. They would recognize that constellations visible at certain times changed over centuries. They would document these changes in their records. And when catastrophe came, when the flood destroyed the observatories and killed most observers, the data itself might survive if refugees carried records or memorized key observations. The Sumerians, inheriting this data, might not fully understand where all of it came from or how long it took to compile. They might not grasp the concept of precession clearly, but they could preserve the observations, maintain the tables, use the predictions, even without complete theoretical understanding. They were custodians of inherited knowledge, not necessarily its full comprehensors. This pattern, inherited data exceeding what inheritors fully understand, appears throughout Sumerian civilization. They possess knowledge that works, that produces accurate results, but whose origins they can't fully explain except by reference to the Anunnaki, to the antediluvian period, to the time before the flood when observational programs operated that no longer existed in their world. And this points to something profound about the Anunnaki. They weren't just rulers, they were maintainers of long-term knowledge programs, institutions that prioritize data collection across time periods exceeding individual lifetimes, civilizational projects that continued regardless of political changes, economic fluctuations, or generational turnover. The kind of institutional commitment that requires stable, sophisticated governance maintained across vast time periods. The Sar cycles in the king list might preserve memory of exactly this. Not individual lifespans, but institutional continuity. Dynasties maintaining power long enough to conduct multi-generational research programs. Governance stable enough that astronomical observations could continue uninterrupted across thousands of years. Leadership that understood the value of long-term knowledge accumulation and dedicated resources to maintaining it. If the antediluvian cities existed for the thousands of years the king list claims in Sar units, if they maintained governmental stability across those vast time periods, if their rulers, the Anunnaki, prioritized knowledge accumulation as a core function of governance, then they could have compiled astronomical databases that would seem miraculous to later cultures who inherited them without understanding how long they took to create. This is sophisticated civilization. Not sophisticated in the sense of possessing modern technology or scientific theory, but sophisticated in the sense of understanding that knowledge accumulation requires time, institutional stability, consistent methodology, and commitment across many generations. The kind of sophistication that builds great libraries, maintains observatories, funds research, trains observers, preserves data, and ensures continuity across political transitions. The Anunnaki, as last rulers of such a civilization, would have presided over institutions that had accumulated vast knowledge simply by existing long enough and remaining stable enough for observation programs to continue uninterrupted. When catastrophe came, most institutional infrastructure was destroyed, observatories collapsed, libraries drowned, training programs ended. But data could survive if carried by refugees. Methods could be taught. Observations could be memorized and eventually written down. The Sumerians inherited the results of these long programs without inheriting the programs themselves. They possessed data compiled over thousands of years, but they no longer had the institutions that compiled it. They had observations spanning vast time periods, but they lived in a civilization only centuries old. They had knowledge that required more time to develop than their culture had existed. This is exactly what you'd expect if they were inheritors from a much older civilization, if the Anunnaki represented the last phase of that older culture, if catastrophe interrupted but didn't completely destroy knowledge transmission, if survivors carried forward what they could and taught it to post-flood populations who would become the Sumerians. The astronomical texts are testimony to this inheritance. They preserve observations that are too old, too extensive, too comprehensive to have been compiled during the Sumerian period. They encode knowledge that required far more time than Sumer existed, and the Sumerians themselves acknowledge this, consistently attributing astronomical knowledge to the Anunnaki, to the antediluvian period, to times before memory when the observation programs that compiled this data were still operating. We can verify this because the observations work. The eclipse predictions function. The planetary tables are accurate. The star catalogues reflect genuine astronomical positions. This isn't mythology. This is data. real observations, carefully recorded, accurately preserved, inherited by a culture that could use them even without fully understanding how long they took to compile or what institutions maintained the observation programs that produced them. The stars remember what humans forgot, that before Sumer, before the flood, before the catastrophe, something existed that was stable enough, organized enough, sophisticated enough to watch the sky for thousands of years and record what it saw. Something the Sumerians called the antediluvian period. Something ruled by the Anunnaki. Something that ended when the waters rose, but whose knowledge partially survived because the last rulers understood that what they'd accumulated across thousands of years was too valuable to let die completely. In the archives at the University of Pennsylvania, there's a category of tablets that rarely gets public attention: administrative documents, boring lists, inventory records. The kind of bureaucratic paperwork that makes archaeologists' eyes glaze over, but that actually reveals more about how a civilization functioned than any amount of poetic mythology. These tablets document daily operations: grain distributions to temple workers, wool rations for weavers, brick quotas for construction projects, personnel assignments, equipment inventories, the mundane details of running a complex urban civilization with thousands of people performing specialized roles. What makes these tablets remarkable isn't their content, it's their existence in such quantity from such an early period. Administrative complexity requires several things: literacy widespread enough that multiple administrators can create and read documents, standardized notation so records from different times and places remain mutually comprehensible, mathematical competence for calculations of quantities, ratios, and distributions, institutional structures defining hierarchies, responsibilities, and procedures, and most fundamentally, the concept that administration requires documentation, that oral tradition isn't sufficient for managing complexity, that written records provide advantages worth the labor of creating them. All of this appears fully developed in the earliest Sumerian tablets, the Uruk period tablets from 3400 to 3100 BCE, already demonstrate sophisticated administration, not primitive record-keeping, just barely sufficient for simple villages, but competent bureaucracy, managing urban populations, complex economies, and large-scale projects. Where did this administrative sophistication come from? How did the Sumerians, supposedly just emerging from village culture, immediately possess bureaucratic systems that wouldn't look out of place in a mature civilization? The conventional answer is that administrative needs drove administrative development. Cities created bureaucracy. The need for record-keeping created writing. Complexity forced sophistication. But this doesn't explain why the sophistication appears immediately, why the earliest administrative tablets show competence rather than experimentation, why there are no centuries of awkward proto-bureaucracy where administrators are figuring out how to keep records, what information matters, what formats work best. The system is already standardized, already efficient, already sophisticated, unless the Sumerians inherited administrative models from the antediluvian cities. Unless the Anunnaki, ruling urban populations for thousands of years during the antediluvian period, had already developed bureaucratic systems, already figured out what records needed to be kept, already standardized formats and procedures. And when catastrophe came, when the cities drowned, survivors who'd worked in administrative roles could teach those systems to post-flood populations. You don't need to preserve every tablet to preserve an administrative system. You just need to preserve the concept, the understanding that administration requires documentation, the knowledge of what information matters, the basic formats for recording it, the mathematical methods for calculations, the hierarchical structures defining roles and responsibilities. Survivors carrying this knowledge could teach it. The villagers who would become Sumerians could learn it. And when they built their own cities, they could implement it, creating administrative systems that looked sophisticated from the beginning because they were based on models that had been refined across thousands of years in the antediluvian cities before catastrophe interrupted continuity. The administrative tablets, boring as they seem, provide some of the strongest evidence that Sumer inherited sophistication rather than developed it from scratch, because bureaucracy doesn't appear perfect. It evolves through trial and error. Administrators make mistakes, find better methods, standardize procedures gradually. This evolution should be visible archaeologically. Early tablets should show experimentation, inconsistency, competing formats, gradual standardization. But they don't. Sumerian administration appears standardized from the beginning, as if someone already knew exactly what needed to be documented, how to format records, what mathematical methods to use, what hierarchies to establish, as if they were implementing proven systems rather than inventing new ones. The Anunnaki, as rulers of long-lasting antediluvian cities, would have presided over exactly the kind of administrative institutions that develop sophisticated bureaucracy. Cities lasting thousands of years, governed continuously through many generations, would necessarily refine their administrative systems, would figure out what worked, would standardize procedures, would train administrators in proven methods. The king list preserves memory of this institutional continuity, dynasties ruling for cycles, governance maintained across vast time periods. The kind of stability that allows institutions to develop, mature, and perfect their operations over timescales that individual humans can barely imagine. When catastrophe destroyed those institutions, the physical infrastructure was lost, the buildings collapsed, the archives drowned, the training programs ended, but the knowledge itself, the understanding of how administration works, could survive if carried by refugees who'd participated in those systems, who'd been trained in proper procedures, who understood the principles even if they no longer had the institutional structures. These survivors could teach, the post-flood populations could learn, and the result would be exactly what we see in early Sumer. Administrative sophistication appearing fully formed, not because the Sumerians invented it quickly, but because they inherited models that had already been perfected across thousands of years before the flood destroyed the institutions that perfected them. This inheritance explains another curious feature of Sumerian civilization: its conservatism, its resistance to change, its emphasis on maintaining tradition exactly. This isn't primitive inability to innovate. It's sophisticated understanding that what they possess is inherited, that loss means permanent loss, that they lack the foundational knowledge to recreate what's lost. Civilizations that develop their own systems can afford to experiment. They understand principles well enough to derive new applications. They can try modifications, learn from failures, develop improvements. But inheritors can't afford this. They're working with partial understanding. Changing inherited systems risks breaking them. Innovation requires understanding why things work, which requires foundational knowledge that might no longer be available. So, Sumerian culture emphasized exact preservation, copying texts precisely, maintaining procedures unchanged, teaching methods exactly as received, not because they were unable to innovate, but because they understood, perhaps not fully consciously but intuitively, that what they possessed was precious and irreplaceable. That the administrative systems, mathematical methods, astronomical observations, architectural techniques, legal codes, medical remedies, all represented accumulated knowledge from sources they couldn't recreate. The Anunnaki were those sources, the last rulers of institutions that had accumulated knowledge across thousands of years. When catastrophe ended their world, they passed forward what they could. And the Sumerians, grateful inheritors, preserved it as faithfully as possible, understanding that loss of inherited knowledge meant permanent loss, because they lacked the institutional continuity and deep understanding to redevelop what was lost. The administrative tablets document this inheritance. Each standardized format, each mathematical calculation, each inventory method, each personnel record, evidence that bureaucracy didn't emerge gradually in Sumer. It appeared complete, inherited from people who'd already perfected it across thousands of years of continuous institutional operation before the flood destroyed the institutions and left only the knowledge, carried forward by survivors who became teachers, who passed it to students who became the Sumerians. Among the most puzzling artifacts excavated from Sumerian sites are small stone cylinders, usually about 2 inches tall, carved with intricate designs, cylinder seals. When rolled across wet clay, they leave distinctive impressions that serve as signatures, markers of ownership, validators of documents. Each seal is unique to its owner. The earliest cylinder seals from the Uruk period around 3400 BCE already demonstrate remarkable sophistication, not crude scratches or simple symbols, but complex scenes with multiple figures, architectural details, mythological narratives, all carved in miniature on stone surfaces barely larger than your thumb. The artistry is extraordinary. The technical skill required to carve these tiny, intricate designs with Bronze Age tools is formidable. But what's most interesting isn't the artistry, it's what the seals depict. Many show scenes that appear to be historical or ceremonial rather than purely imaginative. Figures performing specific actions, architectural structures that match known building types, animals and objects rendered with attention to detail, suggesting familiarity rather than fantasy. One category of cylinder seal shows scenes that scholars call presentation scenes. A human figure, often smaller in scale, is led by an intermediary deity into the presence of a greater deity, usually seated on a throne. The human is depicted in a posture of supplication or respect. The scene appears to represent some kind of formal audience or ceremony, but who are these figures? Standard interpretation treats them as purely mythological. The great deity is a god. The intermediary is a lesser god or protective spirit. The human is a worshipper. The scene represents prayer or divine favor, mythology rendered in miniature stone. But look closely at how these scenes are composed. The figures wear specific garments that match known Sumerian clothing types. The thrones and architectural elements depict real furniture and building styles. The postures and gestures follow actual protocols, documented in administrative texts describing court ceremonies. The scenes include details, plants, animals, objects that exist in real life rather than purely symbolic forms. What if these aren't mythological scenes? What if they're historical documentation, depictions of actual ceremonies where humans were presented to rulers? Where the smaller human figure represents someone seeking audience, the intermediary represents a court official facilitating the meeting, and the seated figure represents the ruler granting audience. The scale difference between human and ruler in these seals could reflect artistic convention for depicting hierarchical status rather than literal physical difference. Ancient Near Eastern art consistently shows important figures larger than less important ones. Kings tower over soldiers, gods dwarf worshippers. Not because they're physically larger, but because visual scale communicates social and spiritual rank. If the presentation scenes depict real ceremonies, if they document protocols for approaching rulers during the antediluvian period, then the seated figures might be the Anunnaki, the rulers, the last leaders of the pre-flood cities. The seals would be preserving memory of how governance functioned, how audiences were granted, how humans approached those in authority. This interpretation transforms the seals from mythology to documentation, from fantasy to memory, from art to archive. The Sumerians who carved these seals in the Uruk period might have been preserving traditions they'd inherited, ceremonies they'd been taught, protocols that dated back to the antediluvian period, when the Anunnaki ruled and formal audiences followed specific procedures. Other cylinder seals show architectural scenes, buildings with specific design features, ziggurats with characteristic stepped profiles, temples with distinctive layouts. These aren't generic buildings, they're specific structures rendered with architectural detail, suggesting the artist knew exactly what they were depicting. But here's the problem. Many of these depicted structures don't match known Sumerian architecture. They show building types that don't appear in the archaeological record, structures more elaborate than what Sumerian builders achieved, architectural features that seem advanced beyond known construction techniques. Standard interpretation treats these as imaginative elaborations, artists depicting idealized divine architecture, fantasy buildings for fantasy gods. Monuments that never existed except in artistic imagination. But what if the artists were depicting real structures, buildings they'd been told about, architecture that existed in the antediluvian cities before the flood destroyed them? The seals would preserve memory of what was lost, visual documentation of structures that no longer existed, but that survivors remembered and described to post-flood populations. The Anunnaki, ruling the antediluvian cities for thousands of years according to the king list, would have presided over monumental architecture, buildings refined across generations, structures that represented thousands of years of architectural evolution. And when catastrophe destroyed those buildings, when the flood buried them under meters of silt, survivors could preserve memory by describing what they'd seen, teaching artists to carve depictions, maintaining visual records of what no longer existed physically. The cylinder seals would be archives in miniature, each carved scene a preserved memory, each depicted structure a lost building, each ceremony a vanished protocol. The Sumerians creating these seals weren't inventing mythological fantasies. They were documenting inheritance, preserving in stone what they'd been taught about the world before the flood, about the cities that no longer existed, about the rulers they called Anunnaki who'd governed those cities before catastrophe ended their world. This reading transforms our understanding of why Sumerian art so often depicts scenes that don't match Sumerian reality. Not because artists were fantasizing, but because they were remembering, or more accurately, depicting what they'd been taught to remember by survivors who'd actually seen what the artists were now rendering in stone. The attention to architectural detail makes sense if artists were working from descriptions of real buildings. The specific garments and objects make sense if depicting actual ceremonial protocols. The presentation scenes make sense if documenting how authority actually functioned in the antediluvian period. The whole artistic corpus becomes evidence of inheritance rather than invention, documentation rather than imagination. And at the center of many seals stand the Anunnaki, not as mythological gods performing miracles, but as rulers conducting governance, granting audiences, presiding over ceremonies, occupying thrones in architectural settings that suggest actual palatial complexes, wearing garments that match real clothing types, surrounded by objects and symbols that denote real authority rather than purely symbolic power. The Sumerians carved these seals to preserve memory, to maintain connection with what came before, to document that their civilization wasn't original, but inherited, that the sophistication they possessed had been passed down from rulers who'd governed cities that no longer existed, during a period that predated living memory, in a world that had drowned beneath floodwaters, but whose knowledge, practices, protocols, and memory survived, because survivors carried them forward and taught them to populations who would become the Sumerians. Every cylinder seal is testimony. Every carved scene is documentation. Every depicted figure is memory preserved in stone. The Anunnaki stare at us from these miniature carvings, not as gods, but as humans. Rulers who presided over a civilization sophisticated enough to develop the ceremonial protocols, architectural achievements, and administrative complexity that the seals depict. And when we hold these seals, when we examine them under magnification, when we trace the carved lines with our eyes, we're looking at the last visual records of a world that came before Sumer. A world the Sumerians themselves never saw but remembered through teaching. A world ruled by the Anunnaki, a world that ended when the waters rose, but whose memory survived in stone, carved by artists working from inherited knowledge, preserving what survivors had described, maintaining visual connection to a lost civilization that preceded everything we thought was the beginning. The seals testify, they always have. We've simply been reading them as mythology, when we should have been reading them as memory, as documentation of what the Sumerians inherited rather than what they invented, as evidence that the Anunnaki were real rulers of real cities that existed before the flood destroyed them and forced humanity to rebuild from fragments. In the deepest levels of Sumerian archaeological sites, beneath the famous buildings and well-documented strata, excavators sometimes encounter something disturbing. Foundations that shouldn't exist at those depths. Construction that predates when the site should have been occupied. Engineering that seems too sophisticated for the period. These anomalies are usually dismissed as misdated, misidentified, or misunderstood. But they keep appearing. At Eridu, excavation beneath what was thought to be the earliest temple revealed older structures, not primitive proto-temples, but sophisticated buildings with proper foundations, drainage systems, and architectural features that match later construction. The excavators dated these earliest levels to around 5000 BCE during the Ubaid period, supposedly before Sumerian civilization proper began. But the sophistication didn't match expectations for Ubaid culture. Standard interpretation treats this as evidence that Eridu had a longer developmental history than previously thought. That civilization emerged gradually from Ubaid roots. That the sophistication represents later Ubaid achievement rather than anything mysterious. The dates get adjusted, the interpretation gets refined, the anomaly gets absorbed into conventional chronology. But there's another possibility, that what excavators found at the deepest levels wasn't early Sumerian construction, it was late antediluvian construction, the last phase of the cities that existed before the flood. Structures built by the Anunnaki, or under their governance, during the final centuries before catastrophe struck. When flooding came, when silt buried everything, these structures became the foundation layers for post-flood rebuilding. The Sumerians, constructing on the same sites, built directly on top of ruins they didn't realize represented a previous civilization. This would explain the sophisticated construction at impossibly deep levels. It wouldn't be early Sumerian achievement. It would be late antediluvian construction, preserved beneath the flood layer, providing foundations for what came after. The chronology would need complete revision. The deepest levels wouldn't date to early Sumerian or Ubaid periods. They'd date to before the catastrophe, before the flood that deposited the sterile clay layer Woolley found. Can we test this? Potentially, by examining the flood layers more carefully, by dating materials above and below the sterile clay depositions, by recognizing that architectural sophistication at deep levels might indicate older construction than conventional chronology allows, by taking seriously the possibility that the antediluvian cities listed in the King list weren't mythological, but actual locations where construction occurred for thousands of years before flooding buried them. Some researchers have pursued exactly this approach, examining sites where flood deposits appear, looking for construction beneath the flood layers, attempting to establish whether sophisticated architecture predates the catastrophe or postdates it. The results are inconclusive because the archaeology is complex, the sites are degraded, and conventional chronology exerts strong influence on how evidence gets interpreted. But the pattern persists, sophisticated construction appearing at levels that seem too early, engineering that seems too advanced for supposed developmental stages, Foundations suggesting longer occupation than conventional chronology allows, all potentially explained if we recognize that these sites might have been occupied continuously from well before the flood through the catastrophe into the post-flood period, that the deepest levels represent antediluvian construction, that the Anunnaki ruled from these locations for cycles before flooding destroyed surface structures but left foundations intact. The Sumerians, rebuilding after the flood, might not have fully understood what lay beneath their construction. They knew the sites were ancient. They knew previous structures had existed there. They called these locations the antediluvian cities, but they might not have realized that meters below their own building levels lay the actual foundations of those ancient cities, buried under flood silt, providing literal groundwork for their reconstruction. This creates a layered chronology. Deepest levels, antediluvian construction, dating from before 2900 BCE, possibly extending back thousands of years. Middle levels, flood deposits, sterile clay laid down during catastrophe. Upper levels, post-flood Sumerian construction, dating from around 2900 BCE forward, but conventional archaeology often collapses this into a two-layer model, early Sumerian and later Sumerian, missing the antediluvian component entirely because it lies beneath flood deposits that separate it from what's recognized as Sumerian. If this model is correct, if the deepest construction at sites like Eridu represents actual antediluvian building, then we have physical evidence of the cities the king list names, not mythology, not legend, but actual urban centers that existed, perhaps for thousands of years before catastrophe buried them. Cities ruled by the Anunnaki, cities where the institutions that accumulated Sumerian inherited knowledge actually operated. Cities that were the source of the sophistication the Sumerians attributed to the antediluvian period. Excavating these levels completely would require removing all later construction, digging through meters of later occupation, risking destruction of well-documented Sumerian architecture to reach questionable earlier strata. No archaeological team would get funding for such work. No institution would authorize destruction of known important remains to investigate speculative older ones. So the deepest levels remain largely unexcavated. The foundations stay buried. The evidence remains inaccessible. But occasionally, when excavation for other purposes cuts deep enough, when construction or salvage work penetrates below normal archaeological horizons, glimpses appear. Walls at impossible depths, drains where there shouldn't be infrastructure, pavements beneath what should be virgin soil, brief windows into levels that shouldn't exist according to conventional chronology, but that make perfect sense if antediluvian cities actually existed beneath the flood deposits that separate them from what we recognize as Sumerian. The Anunnaki ruled from somewhere. If they were actual rulers rather than mythological inventions, they governed from actual cities, cities that existed before the flood destroyed them. Cities that might lie buried beneath the Sumerian cities we've excavated, separated by flood deposits, preserved under meters of silt, waiting for archaeology willing to dig deep enough and question conventional chronology enough to recognize what the deepest levels represent. The foundations remember, even when everything above them has been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times, even when floodwaters buried them under clay, even when thousands of years separate their construction from modern excavation. Stone doesn't forget. Fired brick endures. Foundations laid for structures that stood for centuries or millennia maintain their positions beneath whatever comes after. If we could excavate completely, if we could remove all later construction carefully and reach the deepest levels without destroying evidence, if we could date those foundations properly and recognize their sophistication as evidence of long development rather than anomaly to be explained away, then we might find the physical evidence that confirms what the Sumerian texts claim, that before their cities, other cities existed, that before their civilization, another civilization flourished. that the Anunnaki weren't gods from myth, but rulers from history, whose cities lie buried beneath everything we've been calling the beginning. The King List names 8 antediluvian cities: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shurupak. Archaeological excavation has located most of these sites, has confirmed they were ancient, important, continuously occupied. But excavation hasn't reached the levels that would confirm occupation during the Sar cycle reigns, the King List claims. Hasn't penetrated deeply enough, hasn't questioned chronology enough, hasn't taken seriously the possibility that beneath the Sumerian levels lie older levels from before the flood. Someday, perhaps, archaeology will dig deeper, will question assumptions, will recognize that sophistication at deep levels might indicate older construction than conventional chronology allows. We'll take seriously what the Sumerians kept insisting, that they built on what came before, that they restored rather than created, that beneath their foundations lay older foundations, that their cities occupied sites where cities had stood for Sar cycles before the flood swept over and kingship descended from heaven again. Until then, the Anunnaki remain controversial. Their cities remain buried, their existence remains disputed, and conventional chronology remains comfortable, secure in assumptions that have never been tested by excavation deep enough to reveal what actually lies beneath the oldest Sumerian construction. But the foundations wait, patient as stone, certain as engineering, real as architecture, beneath the silt, beneath the flood deposits, beneath everything we've called ancient, the cities of the Anunnaki, the last cities of a civilization that came before, the physical evidence that could prove the Sumerians weren't inventing mythology. They were preserving memory of rulers who actually existed, cities that actually stood, a civilization that actually flourished before catastrophe destroyed it and forced humanity to rebuild from the fragments that survived. Every deep excavation is an opportunity, every foundation trench a potential window, every cut below conventional levels a chance to glimpse what lies beneath. Someday, someone will dig deep enough, will recognize what they're seeing, will understand that the sophisticated construction at impossible depths isn't anomaly, but evidence. Not early Sumerian overachievement, but late antediluvian construction. Not the beginning, but the end of something much older. And on that day, when archaeology finally catches up with what the texts have been saying for 4,000 years, the Anunnaki will transform from mythology into history, from fantasy into fact, from gods into humans, rulers of cities that actually existed, leaders of a civilization that actually flourished, the last generation of something much older than Sumer, who tried desperately to preserve their knowledge before the waters rose and their world ended. The foundations already prove this. We're simply not digging deep enough to see them, not questioning assumptions enough to recognize them, not taking the Sumerians seriously enough to believe them when they kept insisting, beneath what we built lies what came before. This is the restoration of what was ancient. These are the foundations the Anunnaki laid before the flood swept over. The stone testifies, the foundations preserve. The evidence waits beneath the meters of silt, beneath the layers of construction, beneath the comfortable assumptions of conventional chronology that has never been willing to ask whether Sumerian claims about the antediluvian period might actually be accurate, whether the Anunnaki might actually have been real, whether cities might actually have stood for Sar cycles before catastrophe, buried them beneath flood deposits, and forced survivors to rebuild on top of ruins they called antediluvian, because that's exactly what they were. There's a particular kind of silence that settles over you when you're holding something impossibly old. A clay tablet inscribed 4,000 years ago, a cylinder seal carved by hands that haven't existed for millennia, a fragment of brick stamped with a king's name from a dynasty that ruled before Rome, before Greece, before anything we typically associate with Western civilization. The silence comes from recognition that what you're holding connected to actual human experience, that someone made this object for a reason, that it served a purpose in a world we can barely reconstruct, that it survived when everything around it, the buildings it came from, the city it was made in, the people who used it, all disappeared into time. Only this object remains, testimony pressed into clay, memory hardened into permanence. The Sumerian tablets carry this weight. Each one is a message from people who knew their world was fragile, who'd inherited knowledge from an even more fragile world that had already collapsed, who understood, perhaps more clearly than we do, that civilization isn't inevitable or permanent, that catastrophe can destroy everything except what's deliberately preserved. That memory dies unless someone writes it down. They wrote it down, pressed wedges into wet clay, recorded everything they could, mathematics and medicine, astronomy and agriculture, lore and literature, history and mythology, everything they'd inherited, everything they'd learned, everything they believed mattered enough to survive them. And they were right to write it all down, because their civilization, like the one before it, eventually fell. Akkadians conquered them, Babylonians absorbed them, Assyrians dominated the region. Eventually, even the memory of Sumer faded until 19th century archaeologists began excavating tells and found cities that had been forgotten for 2,000 years. But the tablets survived, buried under collapsed buildings, sealed in chambers, scattered across ancient sites, waiting. And when excavators finally found them, when linguists finally deciphered the script, when scholars finally read what the Sumerians had written, the testimony emerged, still clear, still coherent, still insisting on the same story they'd always told. We inherited this. We didn't create it. Knowledge came from before, from the antediluvian period, from the time before the flood, from the Anunnaki who ruled when kingship first descended from heaven and cities stood for cycles before catastrophe destroyed them. We are restoring what was ancient. We are preserving what was given. We are custodians of knowledge that came from distant days. 4,000 years. That's how long these tablets have been insisting on this narrative. 4,000 years of consistent testimony from multiple cities, from multiple time periods. From scribes who had no contact with each other, but who all told the same story, because they'd all been taught the same history. That Sumer wasn't the beginning, that something came before, that the sophistication they possessed was inherited rather than invented, that the Anunnaki were the source, the teachers, the rulers of what preceded. We've spent the last 150 years since cuneiform was deciphered trying to explain this away, calling it mythology, interpreting it as metaphor, assuming the Sumerians must have been speaking symbolically because the alternative requires rewriting our entire understanding of civilization's timeline, requires acknowledging that maybe, just maybe, the conventional narrative has fundamental problems. That complexity might be far older than we've been willing to consider. That catastrophe might have interrupted human development in ways we haven't accounted for. That the Sumerians might have been accurately documenting inheritance from something that actually came before, rather than inventing mythological explanations for their own achievements. But the tablets keep testifying, keep insisting, keep preserving the same narrative, regardless of how uncomfortable it makes modern scholars. And now, after a century and a half of dismissing their testimony as primitive mythology, we're finally accumulating enough evidence from other sources that the Sumerian narrative is starting to look less like fantasy and more like fragmented memory. Göbekli Tepe proves sophisticated culture existed by 9600 BCE, 7,000 years before Sumer. The site demonstrates that humans were capable of monumental architecture, complex social organization, and symbolic thinking far earlier than conventional chronology predicted. And then that sophistication disappears. The site is buried. The capability seems to vanish, until Sumer reappears with similar sophistication thousands of years later. The flood layers prove catastrophe struck around 2900 BCE. Exactly when the Sumerian king list says the antediluvian period ended. meters of sterile clay deposited across multiple cities, geological evidence that matches textual testimony, not mythology, not metaphor, actual flood deposits interrupting occupation, exactly as described. The astronomical data proves observations spanning far longer than Sumerian civilization existed, star catalogues requiring centuries or millennia to compile, planetary motion tables demanding multi-generational observation programs, eclipse predictions based on data accumulated across time periods exceeding what conventional chronology allows for Sumerian civilization's duration. The mathematical sophistication proves inherited knowledge. Base 60 appearing complete without developmental stages. Complex calculations in the earliest tablets. Geometric formulas without the trial and error process that should precede them. Systems that work too well to be recent inventions. That show refinement across time, periods longer than they could have existed if developed during the Sumerian period. The linguistic isolation proves Sumerian represents the last survivor of a vanished language family. No relatives, no ancestors, no connections to surrounding languages. Standing alone, as if its entire linguistic context was destroyed, leaving only this single dialect preserved because someone wrote it down before the speakers disappeared. The architectural sophistication at deep levels proves construction predating conventional chronology, foundations too advanced for their supposed dates, engineering too competent for developmental stages, buildings suggesting longer occupation than conventional timelines allow. Every line of evidence points the same direction, toward inheritance rather than invention, toward catastrophe interrupting development, toward something older beneath what we've been calling the beginning, toward exactly what the Sumerians kept insisting, that they built on what came before, that knowledge came from the antediluvian period, that the Anunnaki ruled cities that existed for star cycles before the flood destroyed them. We've been wrong, not about the details, not about specific dates or interpretations, but about the fundamental framework. We've been treating Sumer as origin when it was restoration. We've been reading inheritance as invention. We've been dismissing testimony as mythology when it might have been documentation. We've been so committed to linear progress, to the idea that civilization started simple and advanced gradually, that we couldn't recognize evidence of cyclical development, of rises and falls, of sophisticated cultures existing, flourishing and collapsing long before what we thought was the beginning. The Anunnaki weren't gods, they weren't aliens, they were humans, rulers of cities that existed before the flood destroyed them, leaders of a civilization that had accumulated knowledge across time periods measured in star cycles. Teachers who passed that knowledge to survivors when catastrophe struck. And those survivors, grateful and reverent, remembered them, called them the great gods, elevated them from historical rulers into mythological figures, as memory transformed into legend and legend into religion across the centuries that separated the catastrophe from the time when writing could finally preserve what oral tradition had maintained. This is what the tablets have been trying to tell us. This is what 4,000 years of consistent testimony amounts to. This is what we've been refusing to hear, because accepting it means acknowledging how much we don't know about humanity's deep past. How many cycles of rise and fall might have preceded what we call history? How much knowledge might have been lost in catastrophes that archaeological methods haven't been sophisticated enough to detect or recognize? But the silence speaks. That particular silence when you hold something impossibly old. When you recognize that what you're holding connects to experiences, knowledge, and memories that reach back further than our timelines accommodate. That the Sumerians knew something we've forgotten. That they were trying desperately to preserve it. That they succeeded partially, that the testimony survived even when cities fell and civilizations collapsed and languages died. The tablets wait in archives, preserved behind glass, protected in climate-controlled storage, catalogued and studied, still testifying, still insisting, still preserving the narrative they were created to maintain. That before Sumer came something older, that the Anunnaki ruled that older world, that catastrophe destroyed it, that survivors preserved fragments, that the Sumerians inherited those fragments and built civilization from them. And now, 4,000 years after those tablets were pressed, after the scribes who made them turned to dust, after the cities they came from collapsed into tells, after the civilization that created them faded into history, the testimony remains, clear, consistent, waiting for us to finally listen, to finally take seriously what they kept insisting, to finally recognize that maybe, just maybe, they weren't speaking in metaphor. Maybe they were filing reports, documenting inheritance, preserving memory of what actually came before, of rulers who actually existed, of cities that actually stood for cycles before the waters rose and their world ended, and survivors carried forward what fragments they could to populations who would rebuild, who would become the Sumerians, who would remember the teachers as the Anunnaki and honor them by preserving their knowledge in clay tablets that would outlast everything else and still be testifying, still be insisting, still be waiting for humanity to finally understand what they were actually saying. The Anunnaki were the last rulers of a much older civilization. The Sumerians inherited fragments of that civilization's knowledge. They built on those fragments. They preserved what they could. They wrote it down so it would survive. And now, thousands of years later, we're finally beginning to recognize what they were actually documenting. Not mythology, not fantasy, but memory. Fragmented, mythologized, elevated into religious narrative because that was the only framework available. But underneath it all, actual testimony about what came before, about rulers who preceded them, about cities that existed longer than we've been willing to imagine, about knowledge accumulated across time periods that dwarf conventional chronology. This is what the silence tells you when you hold those tablets, that you're touching something real, something that connects to actual events, something that preserves memory of a world that came before everything we thought was the beginning. A world ruled by the Anunnaki, a world that ended when the flood swept over, a world whose knowledge survived because the last rulers understood it was too precious to let die completely. The testimony endures, the tablets preserve. The message remains clear for anyone willing to listen. The Anunnaki were real, their world was real, their knowledge was real. And the Sumerians, inheriting fragments of all three, tried desperately to maintain that reality by writing it down, pressing it into clay, ensuring it would survive any catastrophe that might come. They succeeded. We're reading it still, 4,000 years later, finally ready perhaps to hear what they were actually saying, to recognize testimony instead of dismissing mythology, to acknowledge inheritance instead of celebrating invention. To understand that the Anunnaki weren't the beginning of civilization. They were its last rulers before catastrophe forced humanity to begin again. And the Sumerians, building from the fragments those last rulers left behind, created something remarkable. Not from nothing, but from what survived, from what the Anunnaki managed to preserve. From knowledge that stretched back through cycles into a past we're only beginning to recognize might have been far more complex, far more sophisticated, far older than we ever imagined. The clay tablets testify to this. They always have. We're simply finally ready to listen, to recognize that 4,000 years of consistent testimony might actually mean something. That the Sumerians might have been right all along when they insisted they were restoring rather than creating. That knowledge came from before, from the antediluvian period, from the time of the Anunnaki, from distant days when cities stood that we haven't excavated, when rulers governed that we've dismissed as mythology, when civilization flourished that we've refused to acknowledge because it doesn't fit our timeline. But the timeline is wrong. The Anunnaki were real. And someday, when we dig deep enough, when we question assumptions enough, when we take Sumerian testimony seriously enough, we'll find the physical evidence that proves it. The foundations will reveal themselves. The deepest levels will tell their story. The antediluvian cities will emerge from beneath the flood deposits we've been treating as bedrock. And on that day, history will rewrite itself. Civilization's beginning will move backward by thousands of years. The Anunnaki will transform from mythology into biography. And the Sumerians, faithful custodians of inherited knowledge, will finally be vindicated in their insistence that they were documenting reality, not inventing fantasy, that they knew exactly what they were preserving, and that we, thousands of years later, owe them an apology for dismissing their testimony for so long. The tablets wait, patient as clay, certain as wedge-shaped marks, real as the hands that pressed them, testifying still, insisting still, preserving still the memory of what came before, of who the Anunnaki actually were, of why the Sumerians called them the last rulers of a world that preceded their own. Good night, and may your dreams carry you back to those distant days, to the antediluvian cities, to the time before the flood, when the Anunnaki still ruled and knowledge flowed freely, and civilization stood at a peak it wouldn't reach again for thousands of years. They were real. Their world was real, and the Sumerians remembered, wrote it down, preserved it for us. 4,000 years later, still reading, still learning, still beginning to understand what they were actually telling us all along.